much more, I would say maybe even more subtly in the appendix to Faith and Philosophy, in the lecture that I gave in Maryland, when I'm taking Hegel head on and trying to get over Hegel's anticipation of any objection as any argument against the absolute idea is in principle co-opted by the absolute idea. To the extent to which it would succeed, Hegel understands that it would be just a higher form of, or higher expression of what he understands to be the absolute idea. And there, in that appendix to Faith and Foundation, the way I deal with that is to go back to the beginning of the Hegelian dialectic, and the dialectic of being and nothing, and to deny the dialectic, so to speak, in its root. That is, to turn the dialectic against itself in some way, right? So analogous to that notion, which is, again, not necessarily an easy notion, that the essential dialectic of matter itself is that matter itself is essentially dialectic in the sense that it, before you get, as it were, to the formality of thought, certainly to the formality of thought as it would be understood in a kind of absolute idealism such as Hegel embodies, that matter itself is essentially dialectical, suggests that nothing that otherwise has a standing of its own is denied to be anything but existence itself. So that's what the dialectic suggests here, and the dynamic, to me, my reference to a dynamic has a couple of meanings. One would be substituting it for dialectic in the sense which I've just tried to describe it, and then in the other sense as over against any, in talking about the now, as over against any static notion of the now, that the dynamic of existence itself suggests the complete, as it were, spontaneity or freedom of existence itself, its lack of necessity, which is really nothing more in this thinking than a function of the fact that that nothing has no standing, as it were, of its own apart from existence itself. So, all right, and then the further notion of the dynamic that I was trying to suggest would be the notion that this now is, as it were, in fact, in the language of the Nietzsche chapter, it speaks in a couple of important places, which I hope we'll get to, about the totality of identity and how it's treated differently in what is effectively a reference to Altizer, the death of God theology, which I'll try and explicate a little bit, and in the thinking now occurring. So the identity of thought is the totality of existence itself, and that identity of thought, which is the totality of existence itself, in a word, right, is the now. All right, okay, which is again another way of trying to frame the notion of the and if that now is understood to be existence absolutely, then it is again over against the critique, or in the terms of the critique of Marx, it is not, that now is not being itself connected, right? But it is being itself commodious, right? In other words, it is the perfect fit, the perfect proper measure that being itself provides to thought in the form of the now, absolutely, as its identity. There's a very interesting phrase in today's reading which really struck me. I thought it was rather bold, and I don't remember intending to put it this way, but I speak of the object's thinking. Apostrophe S.
Yeah, I saw that.
You saw that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, at least you react to the right passages. You do. Okay.
The object's thinking.
The object's thinking.
Yeah,
Okay.
everybody's thinking. I mean, this pen, watch it.
Yes.
It may
That's
say
right.
something to you any second.
That's right. That's right. But again, anticipating getting to the passage on this thought of the what dynamic really means here is I don't think we should be picturing some sort of a machine, which is constantly in motion. It has more to do with the essential unpredictability or essential inability to preconceive the now. All right, so that the absolute immediacy of existence itself is what is being pointed to in that sense, and therefore, as I said in a different context, but the same general context, of course, in the context of thinking now occurring, one needs, as it were, to be always on one's toes, right? There is no when we finally do get to the logic, this thing is going to culminate in more problems when we get to the three little digits, all right? But one of the problems, as we'll see with the three little digits, is now this is not totally, by the way, unanticipated in Peirce. The zero, the unum, and the one, and the ways in which they are related in terms of the logical operation of what I call I've now come to call real trinary logic, to distinguish it from the pseudo trinary logic of Peirce. One of the things we'll discover is that there is no one single predetermined way of relating the digits in any given case. To say, now Peirce himself, he doesn't go quite this far. He doesn't have a real trinary logic, all right. But he himself says, when he's talking about the syllogism, which is really great, I mean, I think it would blow Aristotle's mind, is that Peirce says there's more than one conclusion to a syllogism. All right. Now he doesn't. I don't recall that he ever exactly explains what he has in mind there. But this is a little more radical than that. It's not just that there's more than one conclusion to a syllogism, but I might put it this way. There is, in a certain sense, no longer a syllogism. Right? So if you take the pragmatic notion that there's more than one solution to a syllogism, and then de-syllogize the syllogism, completely separate as three independent absolutes what otherwise might be construed to be the interconnected moments of the syllogism, you see, then you've taken that principle of there's more than one solution to the syllogism. Now you've made it the fact that there's no pre-existing solution to existence, right? Existence which is somehow or other distilled in the form of real, the existence which is the thinking now occurring, you see, which is not different from the thinking now occurring, and which therefore is through that medium is reduced, is able to be understood as to be distilled in the real trinary logic. So. Now, I don't actually remember what the question was. Yeah.
Just a reflection here. I don't know how many people saw this article in the Times on Sunday. Tongue-tied by physics. It doesn't say by Leahy, but it could be. It talks about some of the latest findings. Coming from, I don't know, some kind of receptors that are operating right now in the cosmological sciences. It quotes Niels Bohr saying, "We must be clear that when it comes to atoms, language can be used only as in poetry." And then it allows that the latest findings are going to actually turn us from poetry to music, because they found a black hole that vibrates at a certain pitch, B flat. But unfortunately for us, the piano keyboard to actually locate this B flat is 50 feet long, and it tone so low that it takes 10 million years for a single undulation. Right?
I speak in today's assignment of the infinite patience of existence itself.
Yes, right. So I have to say that having read this before I read today's
assignment,
I was predisposed to being patient.
Good.
But I quickly lost it in a number of these absolutely maddening phrases of yours that I'd like you to explain.
Right.
Starting on page 97, the absolute self-distinction of presence itself, presence of absence, the reduction of the body itself, the absolutely objective word now spoken absolutely precludes the glorification of that silence, not itself, spoken in essence, which is nothing itself, the matter itself of self-presence. Now, I know this is not exactly on point, the way you would like to regard the word self. You know, where there's a cleansing here that one perceives in attending these classes of, of self-consciousness, right? But the text, and I don't mean to speak to you because I know you're not responsible for this, you just write it down, I understand that, right? But so the text itself is what I'm addressing here, right? It's not a personal thing, right? But we go over to...
Well, yeah, you mean it's not a self-oriented thing.
Exactly. Well said. Over on page 100, for example, there's something about a precise something, absolutely displacing the presupposition of a new essence, absolutely displacing the totality, displacing absolutely the presence of the body itself, right? What I want to ask you to explain, and I have other passages here that lost me the equanimity that I had by virtue of reading the Times here.
Right.
How you have to be poetic in describing the new understanding of the universe, right? So what I'd like you to explain at some point, you or whomever speaking through you, is why do you have to rely on self, even if it is itself, so much to explain this non-self-conscious world?
Okay, I want to get to those passages for a slightly different reason, because the key word is not self, although self is important.
Well, I would hate to...
The key word is presence.
Itself.
Okay, well that's another...
Itself is you. You used itself in explaining this thing that you introduced.
Correct.
I was counting you.
Yeah.
But I lost count. I can't tell you how many.
All right. Now, a quick answer to this, so we can get if there are any other questions, then we'll start in some orderly manner. Quick answer is that in the passages that you're referring to, in fact, you've just hit upon passages in which I'm heavily concentrated on Altizer. And the key word there is presence. What's being critiqued is the notion of the presence of the body itself. And the basic idea from the root of the notion of presence, although, by the way, we have it just in our English, too. I mean, just stop and reflect upon it. But it's clear in the Latin, praesum. It means to be in front of, to be before in some sense. So presence suggests a certain kind of distance, you see, which is absolute, so to speak, in the notion, in its contrary, in absence. But it's also there in presence, a distance between. If someone or something is present to you, right, there is that kind of gap or difference or distance that's being established implicitly in the language. So that's that. But we'll come back to that. I want to come back to that. But the self that keeps coming up there, the plain self, forget the itself a moment, it's another issue. The self that's being referred to there is the self that's part and parcel of the death of God theology, right? In other words, the death of God theology of Altizer is understood to be through, now this is not, in this part of the text, this particular connection, it'll be made in the second half of the text, which we won't get to this time around, but we can talk about it briefly. Altizer is an American thinker. He doesn't think of himself as an American thinker because when you tell Altizer that there are American thinkers, he dismisses them. He thinks they're not serious. People like Dewey and Peirce, and he doesn't take them very seriously personally. All right, but the thinking now occurring when it looks at Altizer, despite Altizer's preferring to be a Nietzschean Hegelian, preferring to be a European thinker, the thinking now occurring sees that he is very much an American thinker. It's not inconsistent with his Hegelianism, you see, because there is a redoing, in some sense, a very original redoing of something Hegelian in pers, right? And Dewey himself was a Hegelian as a young man, right? So Hegel has been transformed, if you want, radically critiqued already in American pragmatism, and therefore for there to be nevertheless a continuing connection, as it were, between Altizer and Hegel is not incompatible with pointing out that what he really is, which is said in the last half of the text, is a kind of reduction of pragmatism to an absolute nothing, or an absolute nothingness, right? Point being that if we think of Hegel as absolute self-consciousness, American consciousness is move, constructive, profoundly original move vis-a-vis that absolute self-consciousness is, as we said in different contexts, one way of understanding it is to postpone absolute self-consciousness, as it were, infinitely. And that has to be understood somewhat dialectically, because the infinite postponement of absolute self-consciousness in American thought, and in Peirce in particular, is at once the postponement of an absolute specification of the original potentiality, which is at the root of the evolution of the universe. So what I'm getting at is that ideally, in American thought, the other ultimately, the other in the interval between now and the indefinitely postponed final realization, the other comes into its own as something that is in the closer run of things, never able to be reduced to the self, right? And finally, ideally, will in effect replace the self in that what I call that metaphorically that mosaic in which there is an absolute specification. I might almost say an absolute otherness of the self is the ultimate ideal of American thought, never actually realized. So the connection with Altizer and the self is, as Altizer makes clear in his writings, actually in the writing, one of which I guess came out when this book was still in the making in the early 90s, and then one or two of his more recent books in the mid and late 90s. Altizer's way of putting it is that when God negates himself or itself, it's an absolute self-negation. And what that means to Altizer is that God becomes, as it were, or pours himself, empties himself out into. Now, here's the key thing. You'll see I hope you can see the American thing here, and the irreducible, therefore, connection with Hegel. The absolute self-negation of the Godhead in Altizer's Death of God theology is the Godhead emptying itself out into its, quote, its own otherness. See? That's unquote. In other words, the otherness that's taken seriously in pragmatism shows up in the kenosis of the Death of God theology as God becoming its own otherness, you see, becoming, as far as Altizer can take it, the world. You see, we go back to Hegel. What is the world compared to the divine being? It's the other. Do you see? So Altizer, thanks to Peirce, although he would never admit this or understand it personally, or claim to at least. I think profoundly he understands, right? But I'm speaking casually. So thanks to American pragmatism, the Godhead in the Death of God theology is absolute self-negation into an otherness, which, however, here's the clinker, do you see, is its own otherness. So one way in which I later characterized the Death of God theology is, and I make the point in the text, strictly speaking, insincere. Nothing personal. in Jim's sense of the word. In other words, the insincerity of the kenosis in the death of God theology is that God empties himself out completely into, however, his own otherness. You got it? Okay. So that's the structural, serious insincerity in that emptying out. It's incomplete, right? And it has about it an incompleteness which is analogous, not accidentally so, to the incompleteness of the materialization of the ideal in Marx. And when we get to the Altizer chapter, he gets a whole chapter to himself here eventually, which I didn't know when I was doing this chapter, of course. I'm there going to try and show in a very specific, not unproblematic way, the deep, what I was calling kind of chemistry-like connections between Marx and Heidegger and Altizer, prescinding at this point in the text from any explicit reference to the American consciousness, although it starts to come up after a while. Now that may be more than you want to hear at this point, but that's my general, I'm trying to position the self there. Now the itself, since you brought that up, is a problem which I acknowledge. And I think I mentioned this last time when we were doing Novitas Mundi. I would like to, and I'm started to actually do this at home, so to speak. I'd like to substitute something for the word itself. And the substitution, which is awkward because it's going to be, I think, novel, is going to be something like, which I think I already mentioned, a notion of withstanding. All right. So instead of speaking of the table itself, you would speak of the table withstanding, or instead of speaking of the itselfness of the table, you would speak of the standing with of the table. You see? And that would also, you see, the notion of standing with and the withstanding has both. It has at once, linguistically, it has the notion of what traditionally we refer to as the resistance of an object. An object's resistance is its ability to exclude other objects from the place that it's occupying. Right? That's what resistance is all about, effectively. You see? Okay. So in English we would say the table withstands the pressure that I'm putting on it. You see? On the other hand, withstanding, certainly in the context of thinking now occurring, has an affirmative, positive meaning of standing with.
Is that what a person does as well?
Yes, that's right. A person withstands.
A person as opposed to a self.
Correct. That's right. And the beauty the beauty of the awkward language, but we could actually get used to this. We keep saying it often enough. You see, you can get used to anything. My mother used to say, "They say you can get used to anything, including hanging." It's a dark thought. The beauty of the awkward phrase, the table withstanding, is not only that it carries with it the notion of, as it were, independent existence, you say, right, being in its place, but also the notion of being with. What I was trying to get at is the notion of being with is not the same thing as being present. Okay, so in other words, it allows, the notion of withstanding allows for the notion of relationship without the distancing notion, without even the reference to distance. You see, that's really the point. It's not only that there's no distance in withstanding, standing with. So where you can have, another notion that I like.
2 words, withstanding?
Well, I'm still working on it, but I'll take it either way. It's like everything with a dash. You can hyphenate it. You don't have,
I'm taking notes.
Depends on the context. Okay. But the withstanding eliminates the reference, not only the distance in presence, but the need of any notion of distance, because distance has already been co-opted in Novitas Mundi in the appendix when there is no distance apart from time. All right? So, which is also in the end of Novitas Mundi, I think in Alpha, I think it's the end of Alpha, where I talk about the displacement of space itself. Okay? So, so that's the context for the passages that offended you. The self part is from Altizer. The itself is just a hangover, a habitual hangover from our several thousand-year-old philosophical tradition that it probably ought to be cleaned up. I agree with that. I'm not entirely comfortable with it. However, itself, insofar as in English we do use the word the table itself without meaning that the table has any selfhood in the sense of person, it's acceptable. I'm not terribly bothered by the fact that that's the word.
How would you then rewrite this?
All right, what page are you on now?
It's page 107. About 8 lines down, where incomplete word tense.
Wait a minute now. Yeah, okay.
Knowledge itself, the absolute, incapable of being itself distanced.
Yeah, there you go.
So, what would you say? Would you take out in the new writing? Would you take out those 2 uses of the word itself and substitute knowledge?
Knowledge withstanding.
Knowledge withstanding.
Yeah. Or I might say the withstand of knowledge, or knowledge qua withstand, or withstanding. Yeah.
Would.
Yeah. And then you'd be even more upset.
Oh, of course.
But that's the idea.
To be upset.
No. But that's what I'm saying. I would have to do something like that in order to get rid of the word itself. It's not that important to me to get rid of the word itself for the reason I just indicated, namely that it doesn't necessarily suggest self-consciousness.
This book would shrink by about 15%.
Get rid of, substitute some other locution for the word itself.
Then it would expand 15%.
That's true.
Right.
So, let's not do it then.
I have a question about this,
Right.
which is standing with seems to me to imply distance. So there's something I'm not getting. More standing with is like, I'm sitting with Chuck. Right?
Right.
So
You're sitting with me too.
yeah.
The way we think of it implies 2
So-
separate things.
I'm not sure how
relating to each other.
the difference from
So
what I was
that's
saying
what I'm not getting.
and the way in which presence also has this distance, with why one is
Because you can be with
offensive-
somebody who isn't present.
But you would then you could very well use the word presence metaphorically for that. Say, my mother,
Yeah, you
my
can.
mother is present right now.
Right. Right.
So I'm just not sure that.
Well, I think my answer to you is that with suggests a relationship independent of distance.
Oh. Okay.
And that's the way I understand
Okay,
it anyway.
so
That's the way I'm using
so
it.
I was thinking of hunks of things. But
Let
it
me-
doesn't
Right.
have to be hunks of
The,
things.
the presence issue at this date can't help but evoke the whole metaphysics of presence issue. And so the question is whether it seems almost as if rather than warding off the Derridean difference at this point, you're actually pushing for a more powerful presence rather than handling beforehand the question of the impossibility of a pure presence, which is what the
Well, okay.
Right, we'll get there, but
Okay, but except that what you're calling a more powerful presence is not what the thinking now occurring is thinking. It is thinking a more powerful, if that's the right term, using a language, more powerful relation.
Well, which for instance picks up intimacy.
Yes, exactly.
But
Exactly.
intimacy goes along with presence in the deconstructive universe.
Oh yes, in deconstruction.
So
yes,
that's
right.
what I meant by more powerful presence.
Okay.
Erase that, doesn't matter.
Okay,
Just
but
indicates something.
Derrida is next up after we
I
get
know,
through with Nietzsche,
yeah,
so
yeah.
we'll have a chance to go over that. That's right. But I thought you were going for where, in a positive sense, the thinking now occurring is at. It's at a more perfectly intimate relationship among persons. Mm-hmm. And intimacy, when you stop and think about it, although we're so passionate to be intimate that we don't really stop and think about it too often, but intimacy really is impossible unless there are two. In other words, it's a kind of a paradox. Hegel would like it, right? In other words, to be close, intimate, is an inconceivable notion unless you maintain in the notion of intimacy the distinction of persons. Okay, so the withstanding, right, is a intensification, if you want,
of the sustaining of the difference.
Yes, that's right.
It's funny because the first time you introduce intimacy, you reduce it without any things that are.
Oh, I do. In fact, today's reading, I bring it up.
No,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's very hard to tell what intimacy between what and what, because you use it absolutely, as it were.
That's right. And I did something subsequent, which has never been published, that I'm still part of my third and a half project, as I like to think of it, which deals very explicitly with the withness and the the question of intimacy. So, but yes, it's here in the text, but it's not fully it's not developed.
You gave this as a lecture
I did.
at Columbia.
That's right. And I was never invited back again.
I was wondering that. Well, they didn't call the guys in Bellevue or anything?
No.
Were there any questions?
Too polite. I can't remember. I would assume there were questions. Yeah, I think there were, but I just don't. Honest to God, I don't remember. It's a long time ago.
They don't do that at Columbia.
I don't know if there are any questions. I mean, you mean expressed questions? Yeah. Okay.
That's the right thing.
Before I try and start off somewhere, any other further questions, objections?
I do have a question about the gap in motion. It's a concept that comes, the overcoming.
Right.
It comes up several times, and I cannot get my arms around the notion.
Okay, all right.
And then I hope you will say more about the minimum.
Yes, I'm going to do that.
There's
Okay.
not much to be said about it.
No,
Okay.
of course not. I agree.
Okay, any other? Yeah.
There's an overall feeling, I think, in this chapter that Nietzsche seems more to be something overcome than Marx. It seemed like there was more of a feeling that Marx was helping to lead us in the direction of the thinking now occurring, and kind of, not there yet, but pointing in a good direction.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Nietzsche, there seems to be a really, this is a very powerfully written chapter, and there's a lot of feeling of, we need to thought beyond Nietzsche, and I'm wondering if maybe you could address that, especially in context of the kind of thinker that Nietzsche is or was, especially with this notion of his own personal, his thought as a struggle with the potential for a panacea of knowledge or some kind of absolute perspective that would solve and answer all questions. And especially in the context of that kind of thinker, how is it that thinking now occurring is able to make such a strong stand here? I mean, I see it ontologically, but in terms of style, I guess, is almost where I'm asking.
Well, I think now I can't. I mean, I'm just going to have to take your word for it that what comes across to you is this kind of more intense rejection or overcoming of Nietzsche than Marx. That might be true. I mean, I just don't know for sure whether that's what the text conveys. But I would say the relationship to one reason for that I can think of is that this is a very paradoxical thing to say. In his own way, you might say, Nietzsche is kind of like the perfect anti-idealist. But he is so perfectly anti-idealistic, anti-thinking. Right? We were talking about Marx makes tactical use of thinking, right? Marx is in some sense trying to incarnate the ideal reality, to materialize it and so forth, right? Nietzsche would appear to completely, totally, uncompromisingly reject that, all right? To the extent to which the thinking now occurring is identifying thinking essentially as existence, or identifying thinking, so I'm bringing the term, with existence, all right? Or that thinking is with existence, with dash existence, right? Or that with existence, relational existence is thinking, is rational, you see. To that extent, yes, in that context, the thinking now occurring may appear to be more well-disposed toward Marx than toward Nietzsche. However, one of the things that become very clear to me in recent years, and I you'll have to tell me whether it's in the text or not, is that there is a deep point of contact between the thinking now occurring and Nietzsche on a number of levels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not the least of which is that what Nietzsche demands, which I think some reference is made in the text, is that what he demands is to create. Now, the problem from the perspective of the thinking now occurring is that his notion to create is anchored in the notion of the will at the complete expense of thinking. Do you see? So the thinking now occurring looks at Nietzsche and says, "Hey, I like the idea that there's no sitting on your oars here. There's no what I don't know where I refer to it. I don't here, but certainly in Faith and Philosophy, I make the point that Nietzsche, over against American thought, that there's a certain complacency, relatively speaking, of thinking in American thought. The point I make is that, for example, go back to Peirce, who is my favorite American thinker, so to speak, although maybe not personally, because James is a great read, and Dewey is kind of a serious guy. But Peirce is down there at the foundations of things, and when Peirce talks about firstness, what he's talking about is unpredictable something or other, right? Surprise, right? And in fact, being surprised by confronting reality that was not expected is, for Peirce, what starts us thinking. Or put it another way, what Peirce is saying is, he's so good that if we had no problems, we wouldn't bother thinking. Why would we think? Right? In other words, we only think, this is Peirce. If he doesn't literally say this, he must say this literally someplace, but he, as good as literally says it, we only think in order to stop thinking. So in other words,
he says that almost in the doubt business, in his opposition to Cartesian doubt.
That's right.
You have no doubt unless you have a problem.
That's right. You have no doubt unless there's an irritation to thought, and thought for Peirce in this context means a belief. And if you have a belief and you have no reason to doubt it, no practical reason, forget this theoretical thing. He thinks that's absurd, well, mildly absurd. If you have no reason, no, your beliefs are not challenged by people you talk to, or not challenged by your experience of life, which doesn't fit what you believe, and so on. If you don't believe it, why would you change your belief? But thinking is just the process of going from one belief to another, or at least
from
to
doubt to belief,
or from belief to a modified belief, or whatever. You see? Okay. Now, what was the point of that?
Analogous to Freud's theory.
We're
of
on
dreaming.
Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Huh?
There's a great
Dreaming, yeah.
not only dreaming.
We're on the connection between.
Yeah. But all right.
Okay.
So, but I want to go back. So therefore, one simple way of putting this, which by the way has a lot of importance in Peirce's notion of science, right? In other words, we're just speaking in general about thinking as when we encounter something that doesn't square with our existing belief, right? Well, if I have a scientific observation or experience that is surprising, right, which is not what is expected, then what do I do scientifically? I form a hypothesis to explain it. Do you see? And once my hypothesis explains it, then I go right back to business as usual until something else comes along that doesn't square with the hypothesis. All right. So in other words, surprise is the trigger for an active thinking process, which, however, left to itself, wouldn't do anything left to itself. Now, of course, you understand in Peirce, thinking is never left to itself because it is infinitesimally continuous with reality, right? So in one form or another, sooner or later, you could say, thinking is going to rub up against or bump up against the real, which by definition is that which exists independently of what I think, independently of what I think, okay? Now, in Nietzsche, what I characterize that as in Faith and Philosophy is that in American pragmatism, there's a certain complacency of thinking. Right? There's a certain thought is complacent until it's challenged by reality. Right? But in that sense, you could say, from a Nietzschean point of view, it is relatively passive. Thought is relatively passive. You see? Whereas the creative instinct in Nietzsche, right, has no tolerance for thinking, and therefore no tolerance for the complacency of thinking, do you see? And so the whole business, the whole challenge of existence for Nietzsche is to, as it were, to put meaning into things, right? And since I put the meaning into things, I can, of course, always withdraw it. And I think that's a point he probably has in common with Marx on another level, right? In other words, there can't be any absolute meaning for Nietzsche. There's a limited meaning, which is my doing, my way of dealing effectively and organizing my piece of the world. Okay, all right. So that was the connection. But the general thought would be that what the Thinking Now Occurring likes about Nietzsche is his placing the responsibility, as it were, on the individual, on the single one in his own way. So he's like Kierkegaard in that respect. Unlike Marx, he's not a collectivist, right? There are a few of us intelligible ones, like cyclopes living in their caves on the mountains, and they holler back and forth from one cave to another every once in a while when somebody like Odysseus shows up and pokes them in the eye. But they live basically solitary existences, you see. It's not just there's only one such person. It's not quite the spiritual singularity of the person of Kierkegaard, because for Kierkegaard there's no one, you cannot be in the same boat as Kierkegaard. You can't have it. If you have it, you're in a completely other universe. Okay? So there's a compromise already in Nietzsche's solitude, right? It's not an absolute solitude as in the Kierkegaardian sense. It's a more natural solitude, as it were. Okay, but nevertheless, therefore it's only a relative solitude. But it is, compared to Marx, it is solitude, right? The solitary individual, the Übermensch, the overman, right, is responsible for creating. But again, on this limited basis. So the Thinking Now Occurring likes the creative instinct in Nietzsche. It dislikes the placing that responsibility over against thinking as something incompatible with thought, taking thought seriously. And also there's another way in which, I don't think it comes out in this text, but in Faith and Philosophy I think I bring it out, that Nietzsche's notion of this relatively solitary individual who is one of a number of such individuals who bear, as it were, the hope of getting beyond man, of getting beyond mankind, right? Are nevertheless, this is kind of the paradox in Nietzsche, which the Thinking Now Occurring it would be very uncomfortable with. Are nevertheless each of these individuals, as it were, in his language, a piece of fatality, a piece, right? In other words, there is a kind of absolute fatality in the structure of things in Nietzsche. And so the eternal recurrence of all things, which has a moral meaning, right, in the sense that the eternal recurrence of all things is that which the heroic person, right, the heroic person will, right? Now the key word there, the eternal recurrence of all, eternal is the key word, but the key word is of all things, by which Nietzsche means the good and the bad. And he doesn't mean the good and the bad in some abstract ethical sense. He means the healthy and the sick, the decadent, the people he despises. You see? He has no hope, right, ultimately, that this dualism is going to be able to be gotten beyond. So real self-mastery requires one's willingness to affirm, right, joyously, right, the totality of things understood as the irreducible coexistence of the ascending line and the descending line. Okay, but that so his creativity, therefore, and by the way, that's consistent with what I said, that his call to create is a limited. In other words, it's kind of well, that's what it is. It's kind of private. right? It's kind of from an American point of view, it's the private versus the public responsibility. It's really to create in my own backyard, so to speak, existentially, is where Nietzsche's at. He's not into any kind of any social movement such as Marx is. So, but again, if you take seriously the history of thought, one should not be surprised in the thinking now occurring. There's an attempt, I don't know if it's even an attempt, de facto, there is a place there is an appreciation for the imperative to create that is found in Nietzsche. Okay.
Two little observations here. I thought, as I was reading through this, because it's curious that of all the authors that you deal with, he's the only one that you don't manage to find incredibly apt, summative quotations from.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that what was going on here was, on the one hand, that you were dealing with Althusser.
Right.
Right. The other was that it seemed that you were, and I think from what you're saying now, I'm not sure that I'm right. I thought what you were doing was basically taking Heidegger's Nietzsche seriously, where Heidegger's Nietzsche is a Nietzsche who doesn't quite get to finish his work, which is an ontological system based on the will to power.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you can read the extremely fragmentary and shrapnel-like character of the gay science and various other middle period works as basically an incompleted work that you can organize yourself around the concept of the will to power and the eternal recurrence of the same. And that view has, in the last 30 years, come under ferocious attack, mainly from the left-wing Nietzscheans, who see that this is a way simply of getting out of the way of the powerful shrapnel character of the fragmentary texts, which maintain their bite no matter what you reject. In other words, you can say, the eternal recurrence of the same is a bunch of nonsense. The will to power as a possible metaphysical theory, you can let go of that, but you're still hit right between the eyes and various other organs by any given other passage from those texts. And so today, when you were talking about the creative dimension, which is also what Heidegger emphasizes in those crazy massive Heidegger and Nietzschean texts, what you leave out is precisely the provocation of the negative Nietzsche. That is, in other words, the one who actually wants to hit the Persian complacent American with these different attacks. Because if you take the will to power as a metaphysics, then you can say, well, I reject that, therefore I don't have to listen too hard to all of that nasty stuff that's coming at me from every imaginable direction.
Well,
I just wondering where you are with that.
Yeah, I was going. Well, yeah. I think the answer to what I perceived the question to be is that you were probably wrong to think that I was dealing with the Heidegger's Nietzsche, right? Yeah. And I wouldn't think it correct to try and systematize Nietzsche. Okay. Right. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Speaking of fragmentation, our dealing with the last assignment was somewhat fragmented, but I would like to just back up a little bit into toward the end of it on page 86. I think I made reference to this, and I don't recall that I may have, but I want to hit it one more time just to make it the suffering at the top of page 86. Or carrying over from the bottom 85, personality is reality itself in the form of the suffering of appropriation. And the point I think I made last time, which I just want to reiterate, is that what is being understood implicitly here is that appropriation suffered absolutely is the disappropriation of appropriation. All right, it is the yes. I think now that I'm going over it, I remember Walter saying the defanging, as it were, of appropriation, right? And okay, so we did hit that. So I want to dwell on it. And then on page 88, the very last page of that section, I, dropping down to the end of the fifth line, so long as time itself remained the form of an inessentially historical matter, the world remained formally the absolute identity of the individual. Actuality remained purely human. But now, for the first time in history, there is world actuality, the transcendence of the purely human actuality, human personality, actually transcendental, humanity actually existing now for the first time in history, the specific essence or essentials, and maybe actually existing now having to do, this is very dangerous water to tread on any kind of reference to the real world here, but humanity itself actually existing has an ontological meaning, right? But the ontology of the thinking now occurring is not to be distinguished altogether by any means from the practical experience of the world, right? So humanity actually existing here ontologically for the first time in history, yes, but also practically speaking, humanity exists in this world in which we are living. It exists in a way that it didn't quite actually exist in the, now, in the absolute now, 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, right? That kind of thing. So it has not an alternative meaning. One of the answers I gave to one of the comments that Chuck made on the forum in the past week, which went back to one of the to the issue about abundance and feeding the billions and so forth and so on, was that the thinking now occurring is not able to be separated from what I think I called its practical implications, right? So it's not an either or, is an important idea. All right, so humanity actually existing now for the first time in history, the specific essence or essential species wherein personality is transcendentally differentiated from the merely human, wherein and this has so many possible implications, right? Practical and otherwise. So that Jim's objection that the pen, the object's thinking, which will come up in today's assignment, the object's thinking suggests some kind of serious meaning to the notion of person that transcends the simply human. And it might transcend it, we might say, for openness, right, provisionally, in the direction of what we would take to be the inhuman, or even the inanimate, to be more vivid, and then it might transcend it in another direction. For example, in the direction of what Thomas Aquinas would know as the angels. All right? In other words, the thinking now occurring thinks personality independently of its being anchored in the human. Right? Since I mentioned Aquinas spontaneously, this is an analogy, okay? But given a historical analogy, if you go back to Thomas, I think I made the point a long time ago, probably last spring, and I can't remember what provoked it. I don't know what we were talking about exactly. May have been the telos, it may have been the end for which we were created, that type of thing. And Thomas has his own kind of really interesting paradox, right? That I think I mentioned. If you're in the state of grace when you die, as a good medieval Catholic, you're in the state of grace, you're going to go to heaven. You may have to go to purgatory on the way, but let's skip that. Essentially, you're going to go to heaven, and heaven is being face-to-face with God for all eternity. And it's the beatific vision, the vision of God, which makes you absolutely happy, right? As perfectly happy as you could possibly be. The problem in Thomas being, it's not a problem for Thomas, but the thing that slows you up a little bit, or should slow you up, is that Thomas understands that in order to actually participate in that beatific vision, God is going to have to add on to your humanity a dei form. Right? It's, so the human form as such, for Thomas, is not capable of the beatific vision. So here you have this so in other words, humanity has as its goal a union with God. But strangely enough, in order to affect the union, God has got to somehow or other add on or go beyond, in some sense, the merely human nature of the creature in order for the creature to participate. All right? Now, I use that as an analogy. What I'm suggesting here, it's an analogy and nothing more, that in the thinking now occurring, you might say this, that the thinking of the nature of personality, which is not, and in fact, now that I'm saying this, just freebasing off the top of my head, I'm inclined to say that the problem, one way of understanding how it is that modernity got wrapped up in this thing called self-consciousness, is precisely the self is what you think a person is if you can't distinguish a person from a human person. Do you see? If you anchor your notion of personhood in human being, right, exclusively is what I'm getting at, okay, then you have effectively identified person with self, okay? But if you unmoor your notion of person from the human, you have effectively unmoored it from the notion of self. Right? And my classic historical example of that, of course, ahead of the time, in other words, he didn't have the problem. He just didn't. This is one of the great blessings of of having died a couple of thousand years ago, is Augustine. Right? This is the problem he just didn't have. Right? In other words, there was no absolute self-consciousness, so it never occurs to him to think of the three persons of the Trinity as selves. He doesn't have, as I point out in a little paper I put on my website that I gave in Memphis. He had no word for self in the substantive nominative sense of the word. Right? It was purely reflexive. Right? And since there was no reflection going on in the Godhead, there wasn't even a reflexive self-consciousness of any sort. You see? Okay. But so there's no point in going back there because you can't go back, can't go home again. Thomas Wolfe, somebody said that. You can't go.
Augustine did unmoor himself.
Is there a pun there I just missed?
That's bad.
All right.
Turned out to be moored.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say in parentheses, I don't want to elaborate on it at all, but what you just said, the way you just said this, if we anchor the notion of person and the human, then we don't distinguish between the person and the self. It reminds me so much of Mark Buber.
No, well, if we anchor the person in the human, yes, okay, that's right. Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Oh, mind you, Buber.
Yes.
Okay.
It's amazing, and I'll just say that. And
okay.
Go ahead. Keep going.
I read Buber many years ago. And so I don't have a direct response.
Original tree hugging. The I, thou, where the tree
Yeah. Okay, the I, thou, yeah. There's got to be a connection, but I don't have a full recall of Buber, so, okay. All right, the personality, all right, so wherein human identity is the personal absolute, the personality of existence itself in which it is, together with transcendental persons whose pure immediacy remains yet to be experienced in the ultimate perception of the body itself, beyond which is to be not only as now absolutely no being, but not even the inexhaustibility itself of being itself. Now, I said this was an analogy, but now that I'm reading this over again in front of you, I'm thinking, well, there's a pretty explicit reference to the beatific vision, if I would put this in Thomistic terms, right? The inexhaustibility of being itself. Now, for the first time in history, the actuality of work itself is the experience of the essence of history itself. Identically, the essentially practical existence of society, the transcendently differentiated reflection of the fact that creation is now existence itself. In the realization of the foundation of the absolutely practical world, which is this beginning, the impediment of all saying before now, namely, the difference between actuality and the word, is absolutely left behind. Such is the subsistence of the rule itself for the first time. I made a note here that I think one way of encapsulating or summarizing what's being said here is the phrase that I used again last term, that thinking now occurring in some important sense is understood to be the beginning of the resurrection, the beginning of what is in the thinking now occurring at one and the same time, as it were, the beginning of a new heaven and a new earth, the beginning of not a simply new world order, which it would be the pedestrian sense, but of an essentially new world order, okay? And of what, again, in traditional terms would be the beginning of the beatific vision. Right? It would be the intelligibility of the beatific vision qua beginning. All right.
I wish there were time to go through what you just read with some deliberateness. I don't even know what question I want to ask.
Okay. All right. Then let me move on. But if you come up with a question,
Yeah. Okay, I'll go back.
we can.
I'm back in business on the forum, so you might.
All right. Okay. All right. Now today's thought beyond Nietzsche foundation itself. Going back to your comment about the fact that I think there's probably no quotation direct of any length.
No.
Just snippets, maybe.
Marx. And Marx have a lot.
No, but
Nietzsche's
Nietzsche,
the only
yeah.
one that there's
I think another thing that, I think, there could be a number of reasons for it, but one of the things I noticed in rereading it was that even though Nietzsche is central here, it does deal not only with Althusser, but it also deals, if you're reading the text carefully, it's dealing with Heidegger and even Hegel and so forth. In other words, so Nietzsche is used here in a way, a little, I don't want to say quite, this is maybe a little too strong, but a little bit, he's used something of a foil here, right?
but also for the whole tribe of Althusser's literati, for Beckett and Joyce and
yes, that's right. Yeah, right. So in that sense, he's not getting the full attention of the writer, and I think that might be one of the reasons why it has a different format than the Marx chapter.
I thought also because you can't essentialize Nietzsche. There's nothing that you could present of Nietzsche's that couldn't be denied, and then the rest of it still comes at you.
Right. Okay. I'd be the last person in the world who want to essentialize Nietzsche.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
That's the point. You can essentialize Marx and all the other writers. You can find the essential passages which really deliver what needs to be said.
Right.
But you can't do that with Nietzsche. I don't think so.
Okay. Well, in one sense.
Yeah.
All right. Let's start on page 91. Now, for the first time in history, the world terminates in essence. The universe absolute exists absolutely. For the first time, the world itself is essentially historical. The history of history, the existent world. The history of the world, the substance, existere ipsum, existence itself, the absolute actual. Now, for the first time, a second absolute actually exists in essence. I think I better stop there.
The second absolute we all need, I'm sure.
Yeah. What interests me is that when I wrote the second absolute, which is true of almost everything I wrote, and maybe everything I still write, although maybe less so now, I think the essential notion, has got to be a critique of Hegel. And here it is in germ form. Now, I've since, a couple of times, earlier today and on other occasions, I've since, I think, more fully, and at least to my own satisfaction, a little more clearly, not perfectly so, formulated the critique of Hegel that's implicit in speaking of a second absolute. All right? Because if I look at it from a Hegelian perspective, the hell are you talking about? I mean, right? The absolute is the absolute. So
there are whole arguments about how there can't be a second absolute.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. So the thinking now occurring is dealing with the second absolute. It's dealing, therefore, already, in fact, with what, in fact, is the sometimes called the proof positive of existence itself, that the Hegelian synthesis belongs to the past. Right. In other words, the Hegelian absolute is incompatible with a second absolute. Now, looking at the second absolute, if you say for the sake of argument there is a second absolute, right? Then you have blown, as it were, to smithereens the absolute self-consciousness of the Hegelian absolute. Do you say? And what comes out at the end of this chapter, what interested me somewhere, it eventually comes out on almost the next to last page, on page 109, I mean, we could just jump to that because it may or may not help, but I was interested to see myself the connection. At the bottom of page 109, from life itself, being itself receives the absolute midst itself of reality. Exists the absolute itself in the midst of the absolute absolute. All right, so just pause there a moment, okay? So what I'm getting at is, once you've got a second absolute, you now have a relationship between, right? It's not between the first and the second absolute. And as already begins to become clear on page 109, very cryptically, is what? There's a third absolute, right? That's the midst itself, the absolute middle. Do you see? Now, I can't remember. I just don't know historically. I mean, this is what kind of biographical questions are not that important ultimately, okay? But in fact, I just don't remember where I was in Peirce at the time that I was writing this, okay? I can now position this very clearly in the context of my understanding of Peirce. I just can't tell you whether, when I was writing this, I suspect I wasn't too far along, or else I probably would have done it then, all right? But wherever I was in the reading of Peirce, there are many different ways of locating the second absolute, in fact, as it turns out, okay? The first essential one, which is the one I clearly had in mind in using the phrase, was to break apart, so to speak, to be beyond altogether the Hegelian absolute self-consciousness. But now I can position it, right, in the context not only of Hegel, but, and I've already done that by speaking of, imagine, what I was saying I think last time, imagine the Hegelian syllogism. In fact, it ties in with something I was saying earlier about the Peircean notion that syllogism can have more than one conclusion, and then the absolute essentializing of that notion in the thinking now occurring, namely that there is no predetermined solution, as it were, for any existent. The absolute particularity of the decision that each person is, do you see, is another way of putting that. And so I was saying in the context of Hegel that if you imagine that the syllogism, which is now completely exploded, which is another way of saying, on another level, what I was just saying a moment ago, that there ain't no syllogism anymore, right? It's gone. What I have left is these three absolutes. You see what I'm saying? In a Hegelian context. But of course it's not in a Hegelian context because he had no room for it. But Peirce provides the opening. Right? Now Peirce is not going to buy this either. Right? He's not going to buy it either. But he's going to be more vulnerable to three absolutes than Hegel. Hegel only got one absolute. But Peirce has already got two. He's got the absolute first and the absolute second. You see? He's already got those two absolutes, between which, however, he explicitly excludes a third absolute by saying that the third is that which exists of its own nature relative, that which exists at every measurable point of time between the absolute beginning and the absolute end. Right? That's Peirce. So the second absolute is already a complete contradiction of Hegel, right? In the context of thinking now occurring, it opens up the possibility, which is pointed to on page 109, of what will become explicit again, I'm sorry, in the last chapter of this book, where the Trinity is dealt with head on, conceptually. It opens up the possibility, although it's here, but it's not that explicit, in the notion of the midst, the very midst, the midst itself. Right? The midst itself is a kind of quaint. I like it, and it's kind of intimate. The midst, it's better than middle. You know what I mean? The midst, right? The midst, the very midst. Okay, the midst itself, the absolute middle. I mean, it's here. Okay, but so I'm just saying I don't hit it in exactly this way in the text. So the very midst itself is, in the thinking now occurring, it is what relates. What is the withness of the first and second absolutes, all right? So it's here in the text, but again, it needs to be brought up to the surface in a number of respects.
What's the width? Since we've abandoned the self-consciousness of the first absolute altogether, except as referring to the past, what's the width? Except the width that would be with any thinking in the past.
It's the absolute width of the first and second absolutes. It's the first absolute
again,
absolutely with the second absolute. And that absolutely with
is the third one.
is the third. The third is the with.
That sentence that you just highlighted on
Yeah.
page 109,
Okay.
does the initial cap on life and being, does that essentially belong to the past?
You mean the capitalization?
Yeah, you say from capital L, life itself.
Yeah.
Capital B, being itself.
Right.
Receives the absolute midst itself of reality.
Okay.
And there are various other places in this lecture
Right.
where you sometimes capitalize being and sometimes don't.
Right.
And likewise, light and so on.
Right.
I'm just wondering, what did you have in mind when you capitalized and when you didn't?
This is a worrisome question in general. I think in the tradition, the philosophical tradition, the lowercase being I want to say might be pluralized. Whereas being, the capital being, has the notion of the wholeness of being, or ultimate being, or absolute being, or being per se, something like that. But since you asked the question, it doesn't have the answer. The direct answer to your question, with that little bit background explanation, is that in the thinking now occurring, it's not a critical matter. Right.
Well, that's why.
Right. So it's a.
Do it just to confuse the reader, or
No. It's done out of a kind of traditional.
Diversity.
No, kind of tipping of the hat to a kind of traditional way of. Yeah, a little bit.
Well, why do you have?
It's a kind of a
with
philosophically aesthetic
Well,
move.
you do it with light as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes you capitalize it, sometimes you don't.
Right.
Light doesn't have that. Doesn't have carry the freight that you're talking about. That you have to tip your hat to. That being does, right?
Yes, but in the context of the thinking now occurring, you could substitute everything. Remember, everything is context, right? So, but setting aside the different nuances in the context, absolutely speaking, you could substitute light and being. And here's where I want to get at why, even though I'm doing this, I don't know whether tipping the hat is the right word, but whatever I'm doing, this is another phrase for it. I'm operating within a certain, what is it? It's a certain
Convention.
Thanks. There's a certain conventionality to it. Okay.
Shame on you.
Hey, we all have our weaknesses. However, the question is good because the reason why it's not a critical distinction, capital and non-capital, in the text, is precisely goes to the fact that of the notion that, I'll put it with caps and lowercase to show you what I'm trying to get, that being itself is being with a small b. So in order to make that point, it's a little easy to make it with the capital B. Being itself is being.
On page 104.
Or being itself exists.
On page 104, I would draw your attention.
Okay.
You use in the second complete sentence, if there were any bearing of the burden would bear man itself with being itself, lowercase, absolutely light itself, lowercase. But in fact, being itself does not suffer the burden we're using, except in the form of appropriation. So, for which we would have need to return, and then period, right? And then the burden of being itself, capital B,
right,
is so. What are you driving at there? And then later on, you talk about being itself, capital B, as well. And then further on down.
But I've just explained to you it's
in the beginning.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I don't see what it drives the reader crazy to. further down, its whole page is infected with this opposition of being itself, capital B, life itself, capital L.
Not opposition,
to-
though. Not
Well,
opposition to something
well,
else.
Opposition, not opposition. No, just apposition, shall we say?
Okay.
Not apposition either, but I mean, in the
Contrast.
beginning, life itself,
Contrast.
coincidence.
Contrast.
In the beginning, life itself bears the absolute totality as no burden. The totality of life itself, lowercase, absolutely aloft. The abyss itself. As I say, I started this thing feeling very good given this article, but after I got through this page especially,
Okay.
I just don't see why. If what you're saying is that this is just a convention. I don't
Well,
see
I'm not
why
saying it's a
there's
meaningless convention. I'm just saying
It's almost meaningless. You're saying it's almost meaningless.
I'm saying it's not ultimate. It's not ultimate because the thrust of the thinking now. I'm saying it serves a purpose in the context to emphasize something of the wholeness of being, as opposed to emphasizing its what I elsewhere call its absolute differentiation. Right?
I don't think you could justify that if we did an exegesis of this page. We won't do that, right? But I'm just saying.
Well, but take it as a suggested. I mean, he's saying you can't justify it terminologically. It's not being used with absolute consistency. But there is a suggestion of going in one direction or going in the other, and both are in play. That seems to be a fair statement of the way it actually works. That there's one sense of being which is to suggest the multiplicity of beings, and the other is to take being as a totality, as if you could talk about it as a single thing. And the actual position is that being as a single thing really is being as a multiplicity.
Well, I accept that there's no phrase in here that essentially, no term that can be treated as anything other than its simultaneous contradiction. I accept that.
No, but that's what I'm saying. He's saying that there is a point.
But it doesn't. But
well,
it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, I understand the theory. I understand what you just said. But in fact, on page 104 and numerous other pages of this lecture,
it's so inconsistent that you don't feel
it's
that
so
holds.
inconsistent. There is no. Yeah, it's not faithful to that theory.
Well,
could you really test it? Have you tested it with that idea?
I just
with that idea?
Sure, page 104 is a very good example. But I mean, the only reason, frankly, I bring it up is that the last time we had a class and we talked about nothing is thought for the first time. Then I discovered, at least I think you may have discovered, something that was not apparent in the text, taken as straightforward. I mean, to me, nothing is thought for the first time in history. This handout that you handed out. We're not talking about nothing elevated into some substance. It's just a casual statement. Nothing is thought for the first time in history, but existence itself. I mean, you could say there is almost nothing. There is that for the first time in history, existence itself is thought. You don't say nothing is thought. But I mean, you say these things in the text. You use these conventions. They're very. You use brackets on several of the pages in here that are totally indefensible. You know the page I'm talking about in this thing. You have I don't know how many brackets. Now I'm sitting here as a student, willing to be instructed that you're not trying to drive us crazy, and that there's some reason why I forget I was talking earlier to Voltron about brackets, which...
You have a comment on top.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know what the... Yeah, I say these brackets are unforgivable.
what page you on?
It's page 106. But I suppose you're going to tell me that this text is so sacred, although now I see that it itself has to maybe be changed or evolve into something else. But the brackets that are on this page 106 require the rereading to my simple. Right. They don't. On the third rereading, they don't come through as anything substantive.
Read it again.
Keep reading it. Yeah.
Keep reading.
That's why That's where there are 10 of us here, as opposed to 10,000.
It's not a popularity contest.
Good audience.
This is not written for the mass audience. It was not.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's it. You solved. I like questions that answer themselves.
Fit audience, though few.
Okay. The other back on the second absolute a moment. There's another connotation to the second absolute, which comes up again in the second half of this text, but I can refer to it, and that is where in the chapter on the absolute edge, to create, speaking of Nietzsche, to create the absolute edge is the title of that late chapter. I speak at a certain point in that chapter of the absolute independence of the creator and the creature. All right, so another connotation of the second absolute is not only within, so to speak, what it opens up, completely opens up, right? Opens up so that the world here has an absolute being of its own. So in that sense, right, if you take the second absolute as the created absolute, and there I think the notion of the incarnation comes into play, and also a rather complicated discussion then would be opened up vis-a-vis Hegel. But without going down that road for the moment, because what I'm alluding to is that when Hegel envisions the creation over against the creator, that's for him the second moment, right? It certainly isn't absolute. On the other hand, he, in a very, certainly from a theological point of view, what appears to be a very careless way, he identifies the second person, right, with the creation, right? In other words, he identifies the Son, S-O-N, with the self-alienated form of the Father. That self-alienated form of the Father, the Son, is interchangeably for Hegel, is the world. Okay? And that has certain connections again with the thinking now occurring, insofar as the thinking now occurring understands there is a kind of transubstantiation going on in reality as a function of the incarnation. So there's no complete disconnect, not only from Nietzsche or Marx, no complete disconnect from Hegel either. All right, so these things have to be parsed very finely if we get into any one of them in particular. But that's not the point I want to make at the moment. At the moment, I want to make is that one of the connotations of the notion of the second absolute is the notion of the independence of the creation from the creator, as a function in the thinking now occurring of what is sometimes referred to as the mercy, or in today's assignment, I think, the grace of existence, or in effect, the grace that existence is, right? The gift, in other words, as I think I've used the term, the giftedness, you see, of being, the giftedness of existing. So cryptic and tight, but in the context of the history of thought, it has, as it were, simultaneously these various valences, I think, that come out in different ways. All right. On 92, I think. Oh, and I also at the end I skipped over it, I guess, but. Let's go back to 88 a moment, because there's a certain continuity. And again, this is when you say that this is not my doing. You're right. And so when I think the first time I used the term on page 88 in the last 5 lines, the absolute minimum is actuality itself for the first time. And this notion of this minimum itself is knowledge, the actuality of thought itself, being itself, to which in the new state of the world there corresponds no essentially unrealized potentiality. So there's nothing. So this is a fleshing out of the. There's nothing but existence itself. Or another way of putting that, there is no unrealized or unactualized potentiality. Or, in Persian terms, the absolute specification or the absolute particularization of an original potentiality, which is because the original is behind us in Perse. There's a past that counts, because we're not in an absolute middle, an absolute midst. We're not in an absolute now. So there's a past potentiality, which through the middle, the relative middle that we're always thinking in, is seen ideally, absolutely to exist at some always unrealizable, in some always unreachable final future, right? Okay, so now in the absolute now, in the absolute middle, in where the absolute width of the absolute width of the absolute beginning and the absolute width of what would have been a perfectly unrealized potentiality and a perfect specification of that, right, where there's no more potentiality. Here and now we have that unity, that identity in an absolute now, all right? And in that sense, all right, nothing but existence itself, full of meaning, right? So it's not a simply trivial expression. The full of meaning being that there is no unrealized potentiality here and now.
It would seem like that
Yeah.
would be an absolute maximum. I mean, there's such a sense of abundance and complete satiation. And I mean, I kind of appreciate the quality of minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it is also it seems like it's so overflowing.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting you say that. And I don't. I think I had an answer for that somewhere in my mind years ago. I don't have one at the moment, but it's an interesting observation. And I'm going to think about it. But it reminds me of the discussion that we were having, which I don't want to really get into again, about, or we were led into by the use of the term, which occurs again in this chapter, of the term subsistence.
Yeah,
because subsistence has about it the notion of a kind of minimum, the minimum requirements for sustaining or for remaining in existence, right? If I try and answer your question, I would say not maximum, minimum, because go back to the Nietzschean aspect of thinking now occurring. That there is here. Nietzsche has his own, Kierkegaard has the spiritual task, right? I mean, for Kierkegaard, life is an unending task, right? It's a trial, right? Kafka didn't come out of nowhere, okay? So it's an unending task spiritually for Kierkegaard, but his spiritual task is something at odds with his nature, right? Yeah, and Nietzsche have a kind of unspiritual naturalism, a kind of an instinctual life, you see, in a kind of an absolute form, but it also is a task for Nietzsche. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. Well, so no, maximum is the wrong flavor. It's a difference between chocolate and vanilla. Okay? In other words, what existence is the provision of all we need, so to speak. Now, I don't want to be taken too literally here, but get the feel of it. In order to create. In other words, it's not that there's nothing. If we were, if existence were the maximum, well, we'd be back to Peirce. We could be complacent. So there'd be nothing to do. Right? But in a certain sense, there's everything to do, and we have the minimum required.
It seems like maybe the maximum would complicate the simplicity.
Yeah, I think there's something simple about the minimum. Right, that's right.
Isn't it the Kierkegaardian phrase, the one thing needful? Isn't that a Kierkegaardian?
I don't know. I mean,
somebody uses that.
I mean, it's a familiar phrase, but I don't know whether
it almost has that sense that of both the minimum and sufficient.
Yes,
but sufficient
that's right.
in the sense of just what's necessary to do the radically essential task.
Right. That's right. Okay.
The notion of the post-human is that.
I'm sorry. The which?
How
the posthumous. The survivors.
Zombies.
Right. What I'm trying to ask, is that a reference to Alzheimer, or is this? I mean, this suddenly occurs.
It's probably anchored in Nietzsche, but it's not confined to him, right? That Nietzsche may proclaim and declare the death of God, but he hasn't locked up the notion, and he has progeny, as I think Chuck was alluding to earlier, and so one of them might be Altizer or Sartre and so forth and so on. So there are different ways of reading it, but that has that general notion of thinking in the wake of or in the context of the death of God,
Okay.
all right, without necessarily limiting it to all types of usage. Okay, okay. So the minimum starts there, and then it comes up. I notice again here. I think on page 92, if I can.
Top.
Yeah, toward the top. We, embodying the integral absolute, declare today the third day, the day after the Sabbath, the first of a new creation. Now that's a little confusing, I think, unless you're counting the Sabbath is Saturday, it's the seventh day. The seventh day should be followed by the first day, but the first day is Sunday, but the Sunday is the third day since Friday. It's the third day since Golgotha. It's the third day since the crucifixion. All right, so it's the day of the resurrection, right? The third day in that sense. The day after the Sabbath, the first of a new creation, a day without night, for night itself is the necessity of being itself before now. Of the minimum itself before now, the necessity of the minimum. All right, so now, in other words, if we put this in a Marxian context, just for an easy frame of reference, in a Marxian context, right, the minimum is something that is needed, but not in this sense of the word provided. Right, it's not however you just phrase it. Okay, so here we have the minimum. Stripped, as it were, of the scaffolding. Maybe I can do it that way. Yeah, because the scaffolding is like the schema idea, right? So modern thought has erected a kind of scaffolding and confused the scaffolding with the building, so to speak.
Yeah, that comes up as probably what you mean by the simulacra.
Okay, yeah, okay. I hadn't thought of that, but that fits. That's right. Okay. So by removing from the modern notion, the scaffolding, or the simulacrum of the word, right, getting to the substance itself of the word, getting to the substance that is existence, the minimum itself, or exactly what is needed, however it was phrased, right? In this sense, subsistence itself. Such that, the point being, that one now is in the position of getting on with the creation of the world, existing. So there's another place in here, I don't know whether I can put my finger on it, where I thought of Kant again, because in effect I'm talking, if we just jump, it's Jim's favorite page, 104. Oh, I hope it's in the parentheses. I hope it's bracketed. This is not the parenthetical page. Okay. Somewhere on here, there's got to be a reference on page 104 to the let's see if I can pick it out. Yeah, around a little below the middle of the page. In the revolution, that absolutely nothing in the world is what it ought to be or what it need be, that the world-forming word is spoken now for the first time in history within the hearing of thought itself. That nothing in the world is what it ought to be or what it need be. The notation I made in the margin of my text was, this is an early way of pointing. Remember we discussed, because you Adam raised the question of the very first class when I went off on responsibility, and you raised the question of whether it seemed to have a moral tone, and then I kind of corrected it the second time around, the second class I think. I said, well, maybe, but not on the assumption that ontology and morality are now two different things, right? Okay. And so what's attempting to be said here is that what's the scaffolding of something needing to be in the sense of its not being, right? Or the sense that something ought to be in the sense that it is not as it ought to be, right? I want to say in some sense that distinction of necessity and oughtness, and therefore analogously or in a related way, the continuing distinction between ontology and morality, I want to say something like, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but I'll start with this. It's eclipsed in the transcendence of the difference between the two, which is the underlying theme of the Marx chapter, right? So it's almost as if, as I say elsewhere in a much more comprehensive context, there's no time out. There's no time. In other words, the imperative, the categorical imperative of Kant is now understood not to be the categorical imperative of Kant, some sort of abstract formulation to be filled in, so to speak, a blank to be filled in. But the blank has already been filled in by, that's good, I'm playing off the blank, right? There's no blank. Right? Nothing but existence itself. There's no blank to write in. You see, there's no, okay? And so there's no time, there's no presence, there's no distance between me and the content of my consciousness. Even that is a misleading way of putting it. There's no difference between the I and consciousness. The I is absolutely consciousness, and consciousness, the identity of consciousness, is absolutely the thing, or the person, or the event, or whatever. And therefore, there's no time out means that the imperative is to create. I want to say the imperative is to do something. And so we were talking about the distinction between choice and decision, which again comes up somewhere in today's text implicitly, if not explicitly. I speak of somebody, I don't know if I'm going to find it. Well, I'm not going to. The immediacy of decision is what it's called for. In other words, decision in the sense of acting, all right, of doing something as decision, as opposed to having the time to deliberate about it, is the basic thrust of what is a kind of which is a kind of a categorical imperative, right? But the categorical imperative is now to create. The categorical imperative does not exist apart from existing for the first time.
Well, if the blanks are all filled in, where is the space to create?
I want to say there's no space to create.
Right. Well, that's what I would say.
Right.
So why is there an imperative to create?
Well, absent creation, there would be nothing.
Isn't it sufficient?
There's no alternative but to create.
I see. So if we don't create, then all of history collapses. All of essential history collapses.
I guess so. I think yes, maybe, but I think really probably, in one sense yes, but in another sense, I think the question supposes that we have the option or the opportunity not to create. I think an absolute imperative to create says in effect that we have no choice but to create. There is nothing but existence itself. I'll give you another one. We have no choice but to create. We're doing it willy-nilly. Willy-nilly, we're doing it.
And how is it a decision? How is it
already been done.
Actionable?
Oh, I got two questions now.
Sorry. Answer, sure.
Give me yours again.
The sense of willy-nilly is the opposite of do it. Where's the imperative? Why is it an imperative if it's willy-nilly?
The imperative is a function of the fact that the absolute independence of creation, the imperative comes from the receiving of this absolute independence in the form of a gift. It's the obligation imposed, the imperative imposed by the gift.
So we don't ontologically create. We simply receive the gift, individual by individual, and that amounts to creation.
Well,
And can I try something and just
All right.
guess if this is it? In some Kabbalistic thinking, there is a discussion of
Putting it back together again?
of the unity of what they call, I forget the Hebrew words, but recipiency and bestowal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sort of sense of
Right.
what I receive and I give as a single gesture. And that one doesn't separate the condition of being the receiver, and it means specifically of grace or of something coming from something above, as it were, and the capacity to give gifts are part of the same condition. So that there isn't a, what seems like a hierarchy is not a hierarchy because it's a single gesture.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but it's something like that. And the way I would redo it in the context of thinking now occurring would go back to something that I've said a number of different times in different contexts, and to speak about, since you talk about receiving, that the function here is the one in which receptivity is production. To receive is to produce. I'm not sure.
I understand. I'm trying to overcome the obvious verbal dualism into something that I've already sort of processed.
Okay.
That's all. I'm hearing.
Okay. But I'm more comfortable with phrasing it that way because I'm not sure about the further implications of the Kabbalistic way of thinking.
Just those two words. I mean,
but the reception. Now, to go back to Jim's last question, as I heard it, but not as I think you want to exclude the ontological from
Ontological creation.
Yeah. No. In this context, the ontological is essentially creation, and we are, in this context, we are the creators. So it's not a...
Were there no blanks involved?
That's right. Where there would be a blank, if the thinking now occurring...
Existence itself has filled those blanks.
Existence has filled it, or...
So where's the creation? Where's the opportunity to create? Other than to receive that gift.
Well, when you
face up to it and receive it, to accept it, say, there it is.
If I
because
hear
it
you...
doesn't stop there. At the very moment of the reception, there is the creation. At the very moment, if you stop here, the gift vanishes. There's no gift if I don't actually create with the gift that I receive. And that happens without a gap, without a space. But the very possibility of creation, it's not deliberative. It's not, I am willing this from nothing. It's possible because, in fact, I'm receiving existence, and my reception of existence is the throughput, as it were, of creation itself.
Well,
I mean, that's why
I think
I'm
maybe
making
the problem
sense of it.
visually, in terms of gap and space and creation, might be that this is a different way. We're not. It seems to me very clear on page bottom of 95, the notion that we're not. That the thinking now occurring is not thought transcending its own abyss, discovering a new ground, but thought in essence absolutely unconditioned, the foundation itself. So it's not exactly like we're filling up some kind of abyss with something else.
It's not as if we're filling a blank.
Right, and then therefore there would be no room the way Jim is suggesting. It seems like there is no abyss. It's not, it's not, we haven't filled in some kind of modernist nihilism or nothing with some new ground or new foundation. It's the unconditioned thought itself, which is very spacious.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
It's full of moment by moment creativity.
But also no syllogism, no algorithm, which are also structures that have blanks that have to be placed in, that are sitting there in general form, whether it's a simple algorithm like a syllogism or an incredibly complicated one that you could have, like today is being proposed as the origin of complexity, as these, this is that, what's that guy named? Wolf, what's his name? Wolfram. With the whole generation of infinitely complex forms that are based on these simple algorithms that generate unpredictable forms, but they're all algorithms, they're all syllogisms, they're all dead deterministic things, and the great glee in which the multiplicity of the universe is reduced to these rigid dead things is celebrated. So it's like not that.
Right. Okay. Let's move to 97, where we can look at.
Can you just give a brief, either maybe just definition or what you mean by ciphertext?
I use it in a couple of different ways here. Cipher suggests it's if you start with the antithesis to the cipher suggests a kind of undeciphered something or other, right? The cipher is a kind of
so it's the same
code.
as plain text?
Code that has one kind of
So it'd be the same as when you're saying
No, the plain text. No, I associate plain text here with Marx, and I'm saying that there's nothing. How can I put it? There's nothing hidden. Something.
It's decoded. The plain text is decoded.
Yeah, right. But the ciphertext would be associated with people like Nietzsche, and the cipher being text I have in mind Heidegger. And so, and then cipher also has the connotation cipher, zero, is zero in the traditional sense of nothing. Okay? So it's the text understood in the context of the nothing, and also in the context of what? Of a ciphered text is one that's what? Unintelligible. I can't read it. Okay? See? All right, so when I'm saying that all these guys are giving us various forms of a text that is essentially unintelligible. And the claim of the thinking now occurring is the deciphering. So different levels of metaphor. Deciphering the text of modernity. Deciphering it. Unnothing it. Right? Getting rid of the scaffold. Getting rid of the schema. All right. Now, not as we corrected ourselves a few classes ago now, whenever it was, last term, not simply by throwing the schema out, not simply by throwing the scaffold out, so to speak, or throwing the cipher out, or even though it's continuing, I continue to pay the price for this, not even throwing the zero out, not even something going to throwing out nothing, throwing it out altogether, make no reference to it, like this was 1984 or Brave New World, and that the thinking now occurring was new think, right? It's not quite that, right? So yes, right, it's the transformation of nothing, of the cipher, of the scaffold, of the schema, into the substance of existence itself. But that scaffolding, that ciphering and so on was all what? It was all, I want to say, and I'm going to say this because, what the heck? All right, I can take it back.
Foundational?
No. Well, yes, it is. But the ciphering was not foundational. It was all machination. Right? It's all machination. A scaffold is a machination, right? And the simulacrum is a machination, okay? To transform the machination of modern consciousness into the foundation. When the machination becomes the foundation, having about it that quality of constructiveness, of construction, of creation now, you see, which is not the creation around something else or in some pre-existing space, in some Platonic Timaeus-like receptacle, some eternally existing nothing. Do you see? There's nothing there. There's no receptacle. And in that sense, there's no space. Do you see? In the sense in which the receptacle in the Timaeus is a kind of a space in which the demiurge creates. Yeah, we are unfortunate not to be in the position of the demiurge of the Timaeus. Right? There is no space in which we're going to create. We're going to have to create without a pre-existing space, without a receptacle.
Why is that unfortunate?
I was being facetious. Yeah.
So in other words, we have a a vision of creation which is utterly different from the model of creation which from Plato dominates creativity throughout the whole Western tradition of taking a model that is completed and following it in architectural fashion or cookie cutter manner. So the whole idea of creation in which the artist is someone who has a pre-existent model and through technique and execution creates in reality the image that he has in his mind. This is an utterly different notion of creation.
Yes, and much closer, thanks to pragmatism, and here you can say Dewey in particular, among the pragmatists, and Emerson in his own way. I don't say it's exactly the same thing, but much closer to the late, really extreme modern American consciousness, much closer to the notion of experiment.
There's a book that came out a couple of years ago on improvisation in American culture in the 20th century.
Yeah, and then if you think
all across the board.
And you think in musical terms,
yes,
you should be ashamed of yourself doing rock and roll. You should be doing jazz, right? Jazz. See. But what is that distinctively American music? Jazz, and what's distinctive about it is precisely that there is no algorithm.
Now, I want to bring in another piece of this, which just because it's very much on my mind of work that I'm doing, is the whole area of what's called body work, not cars, but where I'm actually writing the autobiography of one of the figures in the bodywork universe. He's calling on the phone and so forth. And he is the creation of one of the major systems of bodywork and a jazz musician, and continuously is talking about precisely this way in which the true bodywork is done like improvisation. And I would say also this recipiency bestowal, that the openness to the presence of the tissue of the other is the exact moment in which the effective touch is able to apply itself, and it's improvisatory. It involves absolutely not having a prior model of what's occurring. It's receptive, and there's no gap between the reception and the action.
And it's interesting that it's body work.
And it's body work, absolutely.
What's the name of the author?
John Upledger. It's cranial sacral thing.
So when you're suggesting that the machination of, in terms of the scaffolding, let me see, I just want to see if I understand it correctly. So if there is some kind of schema or scaffolding that's being erected around what is, I guess, a lack of essence, or you're not, or at least it's not addressing an essence or anything. It's just it's a simulation of the essence or erected around it. And then what we're saying is the thinking now occurring, metaphorically speaking, we can take that machination, that scaffolding, and it becomes, through this this creativity, it becomes, or is all that we could say would be the essence, or it becomes being itself. Is that what you were saying?
I think so. Yeah.
So the very essence that in the past that you could say philosophers were trying to reveal or understand or something isn't even the issue at all. It is only dealing with this thought itself or thinking itself in the form of this what was the scaffold but now is reality.
Yes, and I'm thinking as you're saying, so I'm trying to relate it to. So when I started off here with the handout on the essential dialectic of matter itself, that's maybe another way of phrasing this. So in other words, the traditional, going back to my reference to the receptacle or space in the Timaeus, the space in which there's an opportunity to create for the demiurge, right? The problem with that, of course, is that this is not the omnipotent God, because the omnipotent God had the unfortunate predicament of having to create de ex nihilo. He had to create, but there was no receptacle. There was no opportunity for the omnipotent God to create the world. There was no opportunity. He wasn't waiting around for a good opportunity. Do you see? There was no receptacle. There was no distance. Right? So So the receptacle, the Aristotelian matter, is that in which form is placed. It's the blank. Okay, there's no blank. So if I were to say there was no matter, we'd be back either to Plato or to or Hegel or something like that, right? So no, if the scaffolding has been transformed so that there's no longer a distinction between the scaffold and the building, right, between existence and essence, there's absolutely no difference between them, okay, then matter itself is essentially dialectical and/or it's essentially thought, right? In other words, what otherwise would be. So okay, I have to be careful now. Matter is nothing but thought, just as there is existence is nothing but thought is absolutely nothing but existence itself. Right? So if the way I put it to you,
it wasn't always that way, right?
That's correct. Oh, that's critical. That the role of the incarnation here anchors this state as something new. It is not something that has always been this way. That's correct. This is a function of a transformation. In other words, if we say that the thinking now occurring is in effect the transformation of the schema of modern self-consciousness, that's because that's the proximate form of the transformation of consciousness that has been going on from the incarnation, and so, as a consequence or effect of the incarnation.
This really goes on to this thing that
one of the questions you raised.
Yeah. Which
on the forum.
Yeah,
not this one.
The one about existence, subsistence, as the existence
right.
being the subsistent entities being the efflorescence or the abundance of existence. Mm-hmm. So what was it before? What was creation? Was it a Platonic creation? Was it was it a Platonic model that existed from whenever till incarnation?
No, I wouldn't want to say that.
What is your thought?
It would be, well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind in trying to answer that question would be something like whatever the difference between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament is. Right?
What's that?
Well, I'm not saying I have an easy answer to that. But to the extent to which there's some difference, I'm saying that because I want to say if there's something different than what is now occurring that's anchored in the incarnation, it's not that creation before the incarnation was a Platonic creation. It would be something like an Old Testament or Hebrew understanding of creation.
I mean, I don't even know if you agree with this, but it's usually said that you've got two different models of creation in Genesis. That you have one which is clearly creation ex nihilo, and the other one which is molding something from some kind of pre-existent matter. And so,
well, the latter is John Dewey's reading for sure.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you agree or not, but there's certainly two different pictures. One of which conforms with the creation ex nihilo, in which case, how is that different from what's later? Right. And on the other hand, what's that other one?
Well, the other one would be something like Platonic on this reading of Genesis, in effect.
Something like that, yeah.
Or God would be the demiurge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I would say that's probably not well founded. The opening line of Genesis is that in the beginning God created. I know you know. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, which in the context is effectively to say He created everything.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Which I think is the justification for the notion of ex nihilo as it's developed in the tradition. So that's where I think. Well, that's where we have to locate your question.
Yeah. Okay.
And then so the question would: what would be the difference between God creating ex nihilo, and what difference does it make that there is an incarnation to the what's new in the incarnation?
To the issue of the relationship between existence itself and the sufficiency that's provided for the beings, the existence.
Okay.
That was the question.
Right.
Which you said was
That's
not
right.
true from the beginning, but was only true after incarnation.
That's right. And the incarnation, in its most abstract form, whatever, is that the creator becomes the creature. To borrow again Dante's way of putting things, the fabricator becomes the fabricated. Right. So that's what's new. Now, what difference? So I guess I'm trying to reword your question in my mind. What is the difference between the fabricator making a fabrication, the maker making a maid, the creator making a creature? What is the difference between that, and we're assuming now that the creator makes the creature ex nihilo, or makes the creation ex nihilo, and then somehow enters into, personally becomes the creation that he has made in the form of...
So the transcendental essence of existence is not the transcendental essence of existence from creation up until incarnation.
Well,
existence itself,
if I put it in terms of Novitas Mundi,
yeah.
the transcendental essence of existence... Well, okay, so the first easy answer is, in terms of Novitas Mundi, the transcendental essence of existence, in the incarnation, it's said that it appears in time. I think that's the way it's phrased in the appendices to Novitas Mundi. Right? Implicit, if not explicit in that text, is the notion that the transcendental essence of existence does exist before it appears in time, if that's your last question. So no, the transcendental essence of existence exists, but it does not appear in time until the incarnation.
But the incarnation is not the new thing that we're discussing.
I'm getting to that.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm reviewing it in the relative.
Right.
Yes.
That's right.
There's
So the next step is...
And the next step,
the
which is
incarnation,
right,
and then there's the incarnation in thought.
the effect of the appearance of the transcendental essence in time, the effect of that, since it involves the Word becoming the human being, where the Word and the human person are only one thing. There are not two persons there, right? That, and so in the language of Chalcedon, the Word assumes human nature, but assumes it really, right? So in other words, the divine Word takes on human nature, all right? And so the next step is that the appearance of the transcendental essence in time has the effect, because of the assumption of human nature in reality by the Word, of transforming human nature. Well, ask Aristotle what it means to be human. He'll tell you it means to be a rational animal. That's human nature. I mean, in traditional terms. So it transforms the rational animal. But the rational animal is specifically the animal who is rational, that has the logos. So it transforms that human being as rational animality is transformed by the incarnation. So there's at least a three-step process, depending on how you want to count. Well, and because to use the way
modernity.
Yes. Right.
Through
In and through history. Or in and through, the history of...
So there are three events we're talking about here.
Well, in the sense in which we framed it, yes. I mean, there is the transcendental essence of existence.
There's existence. There's the incarnation of existence. And then there is the incarnation fully entering thought.
Over time, the transformation of the humanity which has been assumed.
Still, the question was, in terms of the thinking now occurring and the current Novitas Mundi and Novitas Mentis, the new abundance, the new condition of sufficiency that exists now for the first time in history. How is this process that's detailed throughout the Novitas Mundi text, how does that affect the question of that sufficiency, since the sufficiency is understood as the sufficiency of existence to the existence. And that must have, what was the case before that? How did you get from the creation, not the creation ex nihilo itself, but after that, from the Big Bang up to
the Big Bang.
No, just kidding. But from creation to incarnation, if the sense of that abundance is the minimum of what's needful from existence to existence, how could that not have been true? You wouldn't have been able to get there. How would you get from creation to incarnation if existence weren't sufficient for existence in that period? So I'm not seeing what's new. Not in terms of the renovation of human mind and all of that, but just in terms.
But I think that's what is new. I'm not sure. In other words,
well, but you're saying earlier.
I'm saying the renovation of. I like novation. The novation of the human mind.
Yeah.
The transformation of consciousness such that it is a sufficiency for the first time, such as it is itself essentially a sufficiency for the first time. That's what's new, and that's what is the effect of the incarnation. And so, if the question is, well, what was the case? Shouldn't it have, or didn't it need to be such before then in order?
No. We were going around and round on the question of what this new abundance means, this transformation, and I introduced everything from Werner Erhard and all of that, in which something at a material level and a kind of exoteric level of history seems to, according to you, be taking place in world history, such that it's not irrelevant to talk about feeding the people, and it's not irrelevant to mention that it's materially possible to do so. But that somehow is to be understood not in terms of the transformation of the human mind, but in terms of the relationship between existence and existence, the sufficiency of existence to existence. But if existence, with a C, were not sufficient for existence with a T prior to the incarnation, how could they have existed?
Okay, I don't know this is the answer or not, but I'll try this.
Are you with me?
I think so.
It's what's specifically and distinctively new here is thought. In other words, what we're talking about here is the reason we're talking about the history of thought and not the history of automobiles is that we're talking about the fact that there's an essentially new form of thought or a new form of thinking. In the part and parcel of the essence of the essentially new form of thinking is the imperative, the absolute imperative to create, and the minimum sufficient to realize, to act on that imperative. Although the world was created ex nihilo to begin with, from the beginning, so to speak, going back to the beginning, human thought, human consciousness, what was different was not the creation part, but the penetration, as it were, for want of a better term, of
consciousness all the way through matter, such that the actual capacity for realizing the sufficiency for the entire materiality is now present in humanity because of the transformation of consciousness, of mind, of thinking, the new form of thinking, which should be able to realize the sufficiency for all beings in a way that wasn't there before. That's the answer.
Right. I think that's the answer.
Okay. We just had to get there. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
Just be patient.
I've been working at it all week.
On page 97, a little below the middle of the page, the reality of the silence of being itself opposite an object is precluded by the object's absolute objectivity, precluded by the object's thinking itself for the first time in history, existence itself, precluded by there being no transcendent differentiation of the object from being itself, by the absolutely non-parabolic being of the body itself. So,
How are you using non-parabolic here? And later on you also speak parabolic. You also say something about parabolic.
Right.
I'm not quite sure in this context. It's a technical term, it's an engineering term, so it's a mathematical term.
Right.
So also exegetical.
Yeah. I guess a number of different ways of reading it. I'm associating it with a notion of, mathematically, I guess the parabola, right? It's but basically, to make it simple, it's an incomplete, or it's a in the Greek, parabolos in the Greek would be a throwing, maybe past or alongside of. It's kind of a missing the mark kind of notion, right? And or an incomplete understanding. Also, it suggests to me the notion of a thinking that is basically committed to the notion of alternatives, if not also opposition as a fundamental framework. So I think the mathematical hyperbola, if you draw it on the cone, the cone, it looks like this and this. The cone goes like that. The hyperbolic plane is the one that hits, as it were, both top and bottom. It's the only curve, in this sense, that's complete. That is, as it were, at the beginning and the end, right? It's that kind of thing, right? So it's the radical incompleteness. I think, all right. So I think I'll stop there. That's basically the notion I'm driving at. But what I wanted to hit on here was the extremity of this phrase, which I had really forgotten, but I thought was very nice, and has the virtue of forcing one to think. See? The object's thinking itself for the first time in history. That's fairly infrequent in the text.
Yeah.
Right? I think it may be a one and only occurrence of such a phrase.
Should we consult this pen now? Or what?
Well, you might. Well, listen. You at least should stop and think about whether you should or not. Right? Now, if you take seriously,
when it runs out of ink, what do I do with it? I'll ask it.
I think you'll just decide on the spot whether to refill it or not. That'll be my guess. That's my experience. When I run out of ink, I get some more ink.
So you were reading along here, and I when I read this,
right.
You really got off the deep end here
right.
now.
Right.
So
another mistake.
Another mistake. So you were much taken by this.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Because
so explain to us why
I'm going to try and do that. Because, as I said, the basic overall theme. This is a very pedestrian and dramatic way of calling attention to it. Is that the content, as it were, the very identity, right, of thought is the existing object, or the existing thing, is the very identity of thought. It is, if I can put it this way now, I'm saying I, the person, not a self, I is, what is it? You are what you eat? I is what I experience. I is, right? I is this. I is this. Now! Don't tell me about what I was. I'm not talking about is. We're talking about is, right? I is this. What it? All right. What? Right. And so, if I is the watch, then it's as much the watch's thinking as it is I's thinking.
Yeah, it didn't bother me. It seems like, well, if there's no self, then any thinking is the object's thinking.
Yeah. Or anything is strictly and truly objective.
Yeah, that's where the objectivity.
They're gone. But I've been with you for years on that one. I mean, see, you've got a pen that you can refill, or maybe not. Maybe you've got one of these
Flip
things too. Okay. Before now, this object was mass produced. And there are billions of them. In fact, I buy them 10 at a time. But right now, with me, this object is the thing that's with me. It is my life, as much as I can't divide myself from the thing that's part of my ken.
For the main reason that you don't have one.
I don't have one because it is the entire business there.
What does it think?
Well, it thinks that life's being held and
I might get involved in that actually, and the day before yesterday I would be an animist and participation mystique, and there would be a demon in here that would freak me out because it would tell me. Yesterday, I would think that to be a civilized, rational animal, there could be no such being. This is simply the mass-produced object. It has no energetic continuity with life. But today, there's a kind of recovery of the animist position without the reification of the animism, without the participation mystique as such, without the self of the demon, but with the possibility that if I need to caress it and become involved in it in an intimate manner, there's no intellectual prejudice that would keep me from doing so. Right?
Right. Okay. Now, because we're running out of time, I want to hit the infinite patience of existence and something else there on page 98 at the bottom. The state of the world itself, foundation itself, which is not a bad thing to pause on, right? In other words, so foundation is the machination transformed so that there's no longer a distinction between the machination and the building around which it was scaffolded, right? So the state of the world itself is, right, or the schema has been transformed into the state of the world, and that is the foundation, is the absolute clarification of the absolute catholicologically being itself. I think I invented that term, but I'm not sure of that, but it just comes from katholikos in the Greek, which is the Greek word for, not simply translated in English, universal. But as I think I mentioned to you early on last year, it has really two meanings in the Latin: universal and perpetual. In other words, it's wholeness in the real Greek sense, in which does not exclude, in fact, includes being in particular, right? In other words, where universal and particular are not alternatives. All right. Absolute catholicologically being itself, the absolute itself, world consciousness. Foundation itself requires of thought itself the infinite patience of existence itself. Thought's possession of what is required of it constitutes the essence itself of foundation itself. And that last sentence goes back to this whole issue of the minimum, subsistence itself as existence. Thought requires absolutely nothing for itself, including nothing beyond the existence itself of foundation itself. Thought itself, qua absolute, hears foundation itself as absolute world consciousness, hearkens to foundation itself as the absolute providence of thought itself, and you could say that the providence, the absolute provision of thought itself, beyond which thought absolutely need not go for sustenance or subsistence, right? Thought eats the bread of existence itself. So going back to the notion of you could say the notion of the manna, the notion of the Eucharist. I was reading, and I can't remember where, you ever read something and then you're going to remember it and then you can't remember where you read it. But somebody, you may know this quote, I was reading it somewhere as a what do they call it, an epigram on a chapter in some book I was browsing through. An epigram from Melville. Now I don't know what Melville had in mind, but Melville says something really neat in this context. He says he thinks that we are all like the pieces of bread broken at the supper by which he means the Last Supper. Okay? And I thought to myself, well, I like that. I like that's Eucharistic thinking, do you see? I take it, because I can't remember this absolutely verbatim, so I don't know that he said we or people or something like that, but that was the context. And so I would say, again, the analogy between American consciousness and the thinking now occurring, the difference only would be that I would assume that Melville, as a good American thinker, had not yet broken through to the notion that the object is doing the thinking. Okay, in other words, I'm assuming he's still making a distinction between person and thing, or still associating person and self, but he's already got the notion, which is not foreign, it's not quite so explicit in Emerson. Emerson says in effect, the analogously important thing is, I think I mentioned to you, that every man, meaning every person, is the Word incarnate. That's Emerson's version. And Melville's little quote, I'll have to go back and find it where it comes from, is that in effect, every man, every person is the transubstantiated bread. It's not just the Word incarnate, but it's every person is the Eucharist. That's what his statement says. So what I'm saying is, as an historical context, it's a big little step. But the next step is that to extend the notion of person. As I said, that person was, insofar as it was limited to humans, right? Therefore, that was part of the confusion of person and self. Unmoor person from human, from the notion of self. Well, once you've done that, there's no need to continue to make this distinction between person and thing, because just as we say in reviewing the text on Marx, even though it wasn't said quite so dramatically in the text, in effect, every person is a commodity. And the anxiety of being alienated in the form of the commodity doesn't exist when all persons have been transformed into commodious things. So it's a kind of trade-off. If you want to have that commodiousness about you, then you're going to feel a little more friendly toward your objects.